As the Western Allies were assaulting the beaches of Normandy in June of 1944, a new type of vehicle could be found driving around the fields of Surrey near the Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment at Chobham. This vehicle was to set the standard for Western tank designs for years to come. It was heavy cruiser A41, to be known as Centurion. The genesis for A41 dates back to October of 1943. The British concluded that by this point, between domestic cruiser manufacturing and the imports coming in from the United States, that they could quit pouncing around with half-arse modifications to excellent equipment and instead build a proper tank to modern specifications. Immediate needs would be met by continued production of the Comet series with its reasonable enough gun and incremental improvements over the Cromwell. For the A41 though, they would throw out the rulebook and start from scratch. The first rule they threw out was the requirement that the tank be transportable by rail. Now, this was a legacy holdover from the early war period where the technology at the time was such that pretty much you needed to railhead a vehicle somewhere. However, it was thought that they could soon enough develop a transport truck to transport the new tank. This became the Antar, and in the meantime, the new tank should be reliable enough that if necessary, it can get to wherever it needed to go on its own power. The next requirement was that it be given a large turret ray. Up until that point, the British designers were faced with a choice. You could either put a powerful gun in a horrible turret design, such as Challenger or Firefly allowed, or you could put a moderate gun in an acceptable turret design, such as Comet. By increasing the turret ring size to 74 inches versus, say, Sherman's 69.5, they made enough room that this tank could comfortably take the full power 17-pounder gun. Now, 5 inches may not actually sound like very much, but it really does have a large effect. Protection against the German 8.8cm gun was mandatory, which resulted in good sloped hull armor and a well-designed cast turret. After a little bit of mucking around with a 20mm Polston cannon, Polston is an acronym, means Poland and Sten, in the Mark I tank, they decided this was pretty much a waste of space, and subsequent marks dispensed with the 20mm, and you just had the coaxial 7.92 Besa. The next variant dispensed with the 17-pounder replaced it with a 20-pounder. This was the Mark III, and it became the de facto British Centurion production tank. The Mark IV was a close support version. The Mark V was basically a Mark III, except they replaced the 7.92mm bases with the Browning 30 caliber machine gun. We were at the Australian Museum of Armour and Artillery in Cairns to have a gander at their Centurion. The first Centurion arrived in Australia in 1951, but this was simply a British Army vehicle for tropical trials. Australia was the first foreign country to order Centurion in 1950. However, the order was diverted to Korea upon the onset of the Korean War and given to the British Army. The first 60 Australian Centurions finally did arrive in February of 1952. Over time, 117 vehicles would be delivered. 96 of them would be upgraded to Mark V/1 standard. The difference between the various marks: the Mark V/1 saw the addition of hull armor. The Mark V/2 saw the replacement of the 20-pounder with the 105mm gun. If both modifications were applied, the vehicle became a Mark VI. As you can see, this vehicle doesn't have the additional hull armor, making it one of the few vehicles that never made it from Mark V to Mark V/1. We start the tour at the front of the tank as always. As you can imagine, with a vehicle with a service life like Centurion, there are a lot of variations on the theme. When the vehicle was first put into service, it would have had a stowage bin for the driver's windshield on the top left and spare track over on the right. A lot of photographs, particularly from Vietnam, you would see 2 road wheels mounted on the glasses instead. This particular vehicle has obviously had those removed. We have a small splashboard and multiple headlights. Sometimes you can also find just single headlights. One unique feature about this tank you don't often see on others is located more or less at the front of the roof over the driver's compartment, and that is a filler port for the drinking water tank. Doubtless, especially in the Australian environment, a very well received feature. Other than that, not too much here. You have the towing lugs, and I will draw attention to the rather simple method of attaching the idler wheels by bolts to the front of the hull. There are 108 track links per side, 24 inches wide, 5.5 inch pitch, single pin. To check it, you want to neutral steer to gather all of the slack on the return run of the side you want to check. Once you've done that, you then make sure that the droop or the sag between the two center rollers isn't more than 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Now obviously you can imagine if the side skirting is attached to the tank, you have to unbolt that and remove it as well, which is a little bit annoying. Actually adjusting the track itself though is easier than most vehicles. All you have to do is simply either remove a retaining clip, or in this case there's a little pinch bolt to loosen, and then you get your large wrench and screw backwards or forwards. Now unlike a lot of the vehicles I've been looking at recently, they've actually moved the screw up towards the end of the idler arm and not down at the fulcrum. It provides a lot more leverage, makes it theoretically easier. However, there is a bit of a design flaw. It was noticed that on occasion after throwing track, the track would be so tensioned that they couldn't brake track, and they couldn't even loosen the track because of the tension being applied to the tensioning system. The solution here was to cut the track either by use of an oxyacetylene torch or by blowing charges. There would be 2 linear charges per armored recovery vehicle, and you would set the charge and literally blow the track apart. It is actually the longest sequence in the manual, is the process that had to do this, complete with all sorts of safety warnings. And I do note that it specifies that in event of misfire, the officer in charge is the one who must undertake the long walk. And it does emphasize in block capitals, alone. I was never very good at that sort of thing myself. I had this terrible habit of investigating bombs with my soldiers. I guess I kept them company, but in hindsight it was probably not the most sensible thing ever. The British have now abandoned the Christie suspension system and gone with bogies to save on the interior space. They're of an improved Horstman design. There are 3 coil springs in each bogie, 2 major ones to do the bulk of the load, and an additional 3rd one to take up that extra effort when the first 2 get compressed. Doubtless changing bogie springs was a task looked forward to by all crewmen. Not all the bogies are the same. The lead and trail bogies have additional shock absorbers in the system. They're up behind this housing up here. Road wheels, obviously mounted in pairs, 2 pairs per bogie. With 3 bogies per side, that's 24 road wheels per tank. Check them every 250 miles. The entire system will cross an 11-foot gap and scale a 3-foot wall. As you move up onto the side, it's all about the stowage. Lots of deep stowage bins for all your Pioneer tools, tank repair equipment, what have you. And you have also on the sides of the turret, the characteristic turret stowage as well. Usually it's going to be more for your personal gear. Further forward, you can see the smoke grenade launchers. And towards the back, the only thing you're going to see is the tow cable and one of the exhaust pipes. Just inboard of the exhaust pipe, you see one of the marker lights, lifting eye, and underneath this appendage you can have the usual assortment of the towing pintle, towing lugs, clevises, and the like. The appendage itself, this marks the vehicle as a Mark V LR, LR standing for long range. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get onto the engine deck. This is much easier without the side skirting in the way. So as you can see, we're now on the engine deck of the tank, and to open up louvers, you have to spin the turret like in most tanks. Unfortunately, unlike most tanks, 90 degrees isn't going to cut it with this. Because of the large stowage bins on the turret sides, you had to go all the way around to the 5 o'clock, and unfortunately it's hot and doing a manual traverse thing. In real world situation, of course, you just put it into power mode and you spin around it. It's not all that bad, only in a museum. So we've opened up the transmission compartment first, and underneath me you can see the entire steering, transmission, braking system. All the linkages are mechanical. You can see the inputs here for the steering, the brakes, the gearbox. Steering is performed by use of the steering brakes, the inside pair of the 2 sets of brakes. But unlike earlier generations of tanks where the brake would slow down a track, what this does is it stops the relative slip inside the transmission itself. As a result, it is powered steering on a fixed radius, and that depends on what gear you're in. In first gear, it's about 16 feet, and in fifth gear, it's about 140. Access to the clutch itself is actually through a panel on the base of the tank in the belly. You can also see that to access the transmission compartment, we've had to lift up the radiators, and this is a similar design. You would have seen this as far back as the Matilda II infantry tank of 1940. Just as I close up the transmission housing, I will point out the fill-up point for the coolant. 33 gallons of coolant were required. These aren't as heavy as some, but they're still not light. So this is the famous Rolls-Royce Meteor, the V12 1649 cubic inch plant, which, limited to 2,550 RPM, would crank out 650 horsepower. This is enough to get the tank going along at a pretty reasonable clip, 21.5 miles an hour forward, 7.4 in reverse, which is much higher than most tanks of the time, in fact almost double the speed. The high reverse speed was specifically requested by British tankers, building on the experience from Italy, where in the constricted terrain frequently the only way out of trouble was to put it in reverse and go as fast as you could. Directly underneath me is the charging set engine. In American terms, this is the auxiliary motor, which as ever you would run just to keep the electrical systems in the tank operating, the batteries charged, without using the fuel drain of the main engine. And fuel was a problem. It used 80 octane or better. There were two fuel tanks in the engine bay, one on the left, one on the right, 59 and 62 gallons accordingly. Now people keep asking me, why do I keep giving measurements in imperial? Well, it's because that's what the tank was designed with. I mean, I do a German tank, I'll do it in metric. Internet is your friend if you want conversions. Anyway, the 121 gallons, according to the manual, will get you approximately 34 miles cross-country, 65 miles on road. This is absolutely pathetic, especially when you bear in mind that refueling at the time was done by handheld jerry cans. The British Army's bulk unit refueling system didn't enter service until 1975. You can imagine how laborious a process filling up your fuel tank would be. The solution to this was the mono trailer. This was a 200-gallon trailer with a single pivoted wheel at the rear. This basically extended the length of the tank by half, was entirely unpopular with the crew, and eventually was removed from service, actually pretty quickly. It was replaced by the addition of a 100-gallon external fuel tank mounted straight onto the rear of the tank. That is the extended long-range tank that we have mounted on this particular vehicle. So we're going to close up now, start off with the cooling system for the 14 gallons of engine oil. Close up the louvers, spin the turret around the front, and I'll see you for part two. Go. This is going to be one of those days, isn't it? Lifting eyes. Underneath, behind this little extension here, you're going to have the usual assortment of clouds, and that was much better. All right.